What I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about the person sleeping next to you every night. Sometimes the most life-changing moments come disguised as simple accidents, like a misdirected voice message that was never meant for your ears. What happened next didn't just change my relationship, it completely transformed who I am as a person. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the most painful truths are exactly what we need to hear. My name is Sarah, and 6 months ago, I was living what I thought was the perfect life in Denver, Colorado. At 28, I had everything mapped out with mathematical precision. My fiancé David and I had been together for 3 years, engaged for 8 months, and our wedding was scheduled for the following spring at the beautiful Garden of the Gods in Colorado Springs. I worked as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup downtown, pulling in a decent salary that allowed us to rent a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in the trendy Rhino district. David, 31, was a software engineer at a renewable energy company, and together we made what everyone called a power couple. But here's the thing about perfect lives. They're often built on foundations we never bother to examine. I was so busy checking boxes and following the script I thought I was supposed to follow that I never stopped to ask myself the most important question. Was I actually happy, or was I just comfortable? Our relationship had settled into a predictable rhythm. Monday through Friday, we'd wake up at 6:30, David would make coffee while I showered, then we'd reverse roles. We'd kiss goodbye at exactly 7:45, and I'd drive my Honda Civic to the office while he took the light rail. Evenings were Netflix and takeout. Weekends were grocery shopping, gym sessions, and dinners with friends who were all doing the exact same thing we were. It felt safe, stable, and everything my parents had taught me to want. David was the kind of man who remembered anniversaries, brought me flowers for no reason, and never left dishes in the sink. He was reliable in ways that made my girlfriends jealous. When I talked about him, I used words like dependable and responsible and good provider. Notice what's missing from that list? Words like passionate or exciting or makes my heart race. But I told myself that butterflies were for teenagers, and real love was about partnership and shared goals. The stakes couldn't have been higher, though I didn't realize it at the time. We'd already put deposits down on vendors, sent save the dates to 200 guests, and I'd found the dress. A stunning off-the-shoulder design that made me feel like a princess when I tried it on. My parents had offered to help with the costs, and David's family was flying in from Portland. More than that, this relationship represented everything I thought I wanted from life: security, acceptance, and a clear path forward into suburban happiness. What I didn't know was that the universe was about to hold up a mirror and force me to see not just who David really was, but who I had become in trying to be perfect for him. Sometimes the most transformative moments in our lives arrive through the smallest technological glitches, and mine came in the form of a 3-minute voice memo that changed everything I thought I knew about love, self-worth, and what it truly means to be authentic. If you're finding value in this story and it's resonating with your own experiences, I'd love to have you join our community by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up. Your engagement helps these stories reach people who might need to hear them, and I'd love to know in the comments if you've ever had a moment that completely shifted your perspective on a relationship. Now let me take you back to the beginning to show you exactly how I got to that life-changing Tuesday morning when everything I thought I knew came crashing down. To truly understand the magnitude of what happened, you need to know who I was in the months leading up to that moment. Picture this. Every morning, I'd spend 45 minutes getting ready, carefully applying makeup to cover the dark circles under my eyes that had become permanent fixtures over the past year. I'd choose outfits that David complimented, avoiding anything too bold or attention-grabbing because he'd once mentioned that he preferred women who dressed classy, not flashy. I'd straightened my naturally wavy auburn hair every single day because he'd casually mentioned early in our relationship that straight hair looked more professional. These weren't dramatic changes I'd made overnight. They were tiny adjustments that accumulated like sediment, each one so small that I barely noticed I was becoming someone else. When we first started dating, I wore bright colors that made me feel confident. I'd leave the house with messy waves in my hair and red lipstick that made me feel powerful. I read novels voraciously and had opinions about everything from politics to art to the best coffee shops in the city. But somewhere along the way, I'd traded all of that for the security of being exactly what David wanted. The transformation had been so gradual that I didn't even realize it was happening. David never explicitly asked me to change. He was much more subtle than that. He'd give me a look when I wore something he didn't like, or he'd go quiet when I expressed an opinion that differed from his. He'd make comments like, "I love how you always look so put together when I wore conservative outfits," or "You seem tired, maybe you should get more sleep," when I stayed up late reading. These weren't cruel statements, they were gentle nudges that trained me to seek his approval in everything I did. By the spring of last year, our relationship had achieved what I thought was perfect harmony. We never fought because I'd learned to anticipate what he wanted and provide it before he even had to ask. When he came home stressed from work, I'd already have his favorite dinner prepared and the apartment cleaned to his exact standards. When he wanted to watch sports, I'd sit beside him with a smile, even though I found baseball mind-numbingly boring. When his friends came over, I'd play the perfect hostess, laughing at their jokes and never contradicting their opinions, even when they said things that made my skin crawl. I told myself this was what mature love looked like. This was partnership, compromise, putting someone else's needs before your own. My mother had done the same thing with my father for 35 years, and they seemed happy enough. My friends were all making similar adjustments in their own relationships. This was just how it worked when you found someone worth keeping. But if you looked closely, really closely, you might have noticed the small signs of strain. The way I'd pause for just a moment before responding to questions, checking David's face first to gauge the right answer. The way I'd catch myself mid-sentence and redirect my thoughts towards safer territory. The slight tension in my shoulders that had become so constant, I'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly relaxed. I'd gained 15 pounds over the course of our relationship, not from happiness, but from stress eating late at night when David was asleep. I'd lie in bed beside him, scrolling through social media and mindlessly consuming whatever was in the kitchen, trying to fill a void I couldn't even name. My sleep was restless, filled with dreams where I was always late for something or looking for something I'd lost. I'd wake up feeling exhausted before the day had even begun. My work performance had started to suffer too. I used to be the creative one on our marketing team, the person who came up with bold campaign ideas that got clients excited. But over the past year, I'd become increasingly conservative in my suggestions, second-guessing every instinct and defaulting to safe, boring approaches that wouldn't risk failure. My boss, Jennifer, had pulled me aside more than once to ask if everything was okay, noting that I seemed to have lost my creative spark. The truth was, I had lost it. I'd traded my authentic self for relationship security, and I didn't even realize how much I'd given up until it was almost too late. I thought I was being smart, practical, mature. I thought I was choosing stability over chaos, partnership over independence. What I didn't understand was that I was slowly erasing myself, one small compromise at a time. My friends had started to notice too, though they were too polite to say anything directly. During girls' nights out, they'd sometimes look at me with concern when I'd automatically order whatever David would approve of, or when I'd check my phone obsessively to make sure he wasn't wondering where I was. My best friend Emma had tried to bring it up once, asking if I was happy, really happy. But I'd brushed off her concerns with talk about wedding planning and how excited I was about my future. The wedding planning itself had become a perfect metaphor for our entire relationship. Every decision we made was filtered through David's preferences first. He wanted a small wedding, so we cut the guest list. He preferred traditional vows, so I scrapped the personal ones I'd been writing. He thought a DJ would be more practical than a live band, so we booked a DJ. He wanted his college roommate as the officiant, so we went with someone I'd never met instead of my childhood pastor. Each individual decision seemed reasonable, even caring. David was being practical about costs, thinking about logistics, trying to make sure everything went smoothly. But the cumulative effect was that our wedding was becoming a celebration of his vision of our future, with very little input from me about what would make me happy. I remember one particularly telling moment during a cake tasting in February. We'd tried 7 different flavors, And I'd fallen in love with a lemon cake with raspberry filling that reminded me of my grandmother's birthday cakes from childhood. It made me smile in a way I hadn't felt in months. But David preferred the vanilla with chocolate ganache, saying it was more traditional and would appeal to more people. Without even thinking about it, I agreed. "You're right," I said. "Vanilla is the safe choice." The baker looked at me strangely, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror behind the counter. I looked like someone going through the motions of being happy, rather than someone who actually was. But I pushed that observation away, telling myself that compromise was what relationships were about. Looking back now, I can see that I was living in a constant state of low-level anxiety, always monitoring David's mood, always trying to anticipate what he needed, always making sure I was being the kind of woman he wanted to marry. I'd wake up each morning and put on not just clothes and makeup, but an entire personality that I thought would keep him happy and keep our relationship secure. The irony is that I thought I was being selfless, but I was actually being incredibly selfish in a twisted way. I was so focused on keeping David happy that I'd stopped considering what he might actually want from a partner. Maybe he would have preferred a woman with her own opinions, her own interests, her own fire. Maybe the person I was becoming was as disappointing to him as it was secretly exhausting for me. But I was so afraid of rocking the boat, so terrified that if I showed him who I really was, he might decide I wasn't worth keeping, that I kept playing this role of the perfect girlfriend, the perfect fiancé, the perfect future wife. I'd convinced myself that this was love, that this was what it meant to be a good partner. What I didn't know was that David was having his own struggles with our relationship, his own doubts that he was sharing with the people closest to him. While I was busy trying to be perfect for him, he was processing his own feelings about who I'd become and whether the woman he was about to marry was someone he could actually spend his life with. The universe has a funny way of forcing us to confront truths we're not ready to face. And mine was about to arrive in the form of a technological accident that would shatter every illusion I'd built about my perfect relationship and my perfect life. But before I tell you about that moment, you need to understand just how deep I was in this pattern, how completely I'd lost sight of who I used to be. It was a Tuesday morning in March, one of those crisp Denver days where the air is thin and clear and full of possibility. I was sitting at my desk at work, going through the motions of reviewing a social media campaign that felt as bland and safe as everything else in my life had become, when my phone buzzed with a notification that would change everything. The notification was from David, a voice message, which was unusual because he typically sent quick texts during work hours. I smiled, thinking maybe he was being romantic, sending me something sweet to brighten my Tuesday. I plugged in my earbuds and hit play, expecting to hear his familiar voice telling me he loved me or asking what I wanted for dinner. Instead, what I heard made my blood run cold. "Hey Megan, sorry I missed your call. I'm at work, but I had to get this off my chest." His voice sounded different, more relaxed and honest than it ever did when he talked to me. "I've been thinking about what you said last weekend about Sarah, and you're absolutely right. She's become this completely different person, and honestly, I don't know if I can go through with the wedding." My hands started shaking. This was meant for his sister Megan, not me. I should have stopped listening. But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but sit frozen as my fiancé continued to tear apart everything I thought we had built together. Remember how she used to be when I first met her? She had this fire, you know? She'd argue with me about movies. She'd wear these crazy, colorful outfits. She'd drag me to art galleries and poetry readings. I was actually attracted to that energy, that independence. But now, God, Megan, it's like she's become this people-pleasing robot who just agrees with everything I say. I felt like I was watching my life from outside my body, like this was happening to someone else. The office around me continued its normal hum of activity, my coworkers typing and taking calls, completely unaware that my entire world was imploding through a pair of tiny earbuds. The worst part is, I think it's partly my fault, David continued. I remember making comments early on, about how I liked it when she dressed a certain way or when she agreed with me on things. I thought I was just expressing preferences, but looking back, I think I was training her to be someone else. And now she is someone else, and I realize I don't actually want that. If you think that was the hardest part to hear, you're wrong. What came next was infinitely worse. She's so desperate to please me that she's lost all her personality. Like yesterday, she asked me 3 times if I liked her new lipstick. 3 times, Megan, the same question. And when I said it was fine, she went to the bathroom and changed it because she thought fine meant I didn't like it. I can't even have a conversation with her anymore because she's so busy trying to figure out what I want to hear. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. Around me, my coworkers continued their day, oblivious to the fact that I was falling apart in slow motion. Remember that time in February when we went to that Mexican restaurant with you guys? She ordered the exact same thing I did, even though I know she doesn't like spicy food. She sat there forcing down these jalapeno-covered enchiladas because she thought that's what I wanted her to do. I wanted to tell her to order what she actually wanted, but I didn't know how to do it without making a scene. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that dinner vividly. I'd seen David order first and panicked, thinking I should show him we had similar tastes. I'd spent the entire meal in agony, my mouth burning, chugging water, and pretending everything was delicious. I'd thought I was being a good girlfriend, showing him how compatible we were. The thing is, David's voice continued, I don't think she even knows she's doing it anymore. It's like she's so far gone into this performance of being the perfect girlfriend that she's forgotten who she actually is. And the crazy part is, the person she's trying to be isn't even someone I want to marry. I had to pause the message. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed too bright, the keyboard clicks from nearby desks too loud. Everything felt surreal, like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare, but I wasn't done listening. I couldn't stop myself from pressing play again, even though every word was like a knife to my heart. I keep thinking about Mom and Dad, you know? Remember how Mom always deferred to Dad about everything? How she'd ask his opinion before she'd express her own? How she'd laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny? I swore I'd never want that kind of relationship, but somehow that's exactly what I've created with Sarah. The comparison to his mother was devastating. I'd met David's parents several times, and I'd always noticed how his mother seemed to fade into the background whenever his father was around. She was a lovely woman, but she had no presence, no voice of her own. The idea that I'd become that person, that David saw me the way his father saw his mother, made me feel sick. The wedding is in 8 months, and I'm terrified, Meg. Not excited, terrified. I keep thinking about waking up every day for the next 50 years with someone who asks my permission to exist. Someone who's so focused on making me happy that she's forgotten how to be happy herself. He paused, and I could hear him sigh deeply. And here's the really messed up part. I think part of me enabled this because it was easier. It's comfortable to be with someone who never challenges you, who never makes you question yourself or grow or change. But comfortable isn't love, is it? Comfortable is just safe. And I don't think either of us is actually happy. The message was almost over, but David had one more thing that would haunt me for weeks. I love her, Megan, I really do. But I'm starting to think I love the memory of who she used to be more than who she is now. And that's not fair to either of us. I don't know what to do about the wedding, about the deposits, about all the people expecting us to get married. But I can't shake the feeling that if we go through with this, we're both going to end up miserable. The message ended with David saying he'd call her later and asking her not to mention their conversation to anyone else. I sat there staring at my phone screen, the silence in my ears deafening after 3 minutes of having my entire self-perception destroyed. My first instinct was denial. This couldn't be right. David loved me. He'd proposed to me. He told me I was beautiful every day. He brought me flowers and remembered important dates and introduced me to his friends with pride. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding, or maybe he was just having pre-wedding jitters that every groom experienced. But as I sat there, replaying every word he'd said, I couldn't deny the ring of truth in his observations. The lipstick incident had happened exactly as he described it. I had ordered the same spicy food he did, despite hating spicy food. I had been asking his opinion about everything from what to wear, to what to watch on Netflix, to what to order at restaurants. I thought about the last time I'd expressed a strong opinion about anything, and I couldn't remember. I thought about the last time I disagreed with David about something significant and came up empty. I thought about the last time I'd done something just for myself, without considering what David would think about it, and realized it had been months. The woman he was describing, this people-pleasing robot who'd lost all her personality, was exactly who I'd become. And the worst part was, I'd done it intentionally. I'd systematically erased every part of myself that I thought might create conflict or make him question whether I was the right person for him. I sat at my desk for the rest of that morning in a state of shock, mechanically going through the motions of work while my mind reeled. Every interaction I'd had with David over the past year suddenly looked different. Every time he'd gone quiet when I expressed an opinion, every time he'd given me that look when I wore something he didn't like, every time he'd made a comment about preferring women who were agreeable or easygoing, I'd taken as guidance about how to be a better girlfriend. But what if those hadn't been instructions for improvement? What if they'd been expressions of disappointment? What if every time I changed something about myself to make him happy, I'd actually been moving further away from the person he'd fallen in love with? I tried to focus on work, but everything felt meaningless. How could I care about marketing campaigns and social media metrics when my entire life had just been revealed to be built on a foundation of lies I'd been telling myself? I kept checking my phone, wondering if David had realized he'd sent the message to the wrong person. But there was nothing. Just that devastating voice memo sitting in our text thread like a bomb that had already exploded. Lunchtime came and went, and I couldn't eat. My stomach was in knots, my hands were shaking, and I felt like I might throw up at any moment. I kept thinking about all the ways I'd changed myself over the past 3 years, all the pieces of my authentic self I'd traded away for relationship security. My coworker Lisa stopped by my desk around 2 o'clock to ask if I was okay. She said I looked pale and seemed distracted. I made up some excuse about not feeling well, which wasn't entirely untrue. I felt like I was coming down with something, except the sickness was the slow realization that I'd lost myself so completely that even the man I was supposed to marry couldn't see who I really was anymore. The afternoon dragged on with painful slowness. Every minute felt like an hour as I tried to figure out what to do with this information. Should I confront David immediately? Should I pretend I'd never heard it? Should I call off the wedding? Should I try to become the person I used to be? But here's what I kept coming back to. David was right about everything he'd said. I had become a people-pleasing robot. I had lost my fire, my independence, my authentic self. I had been asking his permission to exist, and I'd been doing it for so long that I didn't even remember how to make decisions for myself anymore. The person he'd described in that voice memo, the woman I used to be who wore colorful clothes and had strong opinions and dragged him to poetry readings, felt like a stranger to me now. I couldn't remember the last time I'd bought a piece of clothing because I loved it, not because I thought David would approve. I couldn't remember the last time I'd read a book that challenged me or excited me instead of just mindlessly scrolling through social media every night. I'd become exactly the kind of woman I used to pity, the kind who defined herself entirely through her relationship, who had no identity outside of being someone's girlfriend. And the cruelest irony was that in trying so hard to keep David happy, I'd become someone who made him miserable too. By the time 5 o'clock arrived, I knew I couldn't go home and pretend everything was normal. I couldn't sit across from David at dinner and make small talk about our days, knowing what I now knew about how he really saw me. I couldn't kiss him goodnight and curl up beside him, knowing that he was lying there, questioning whether he wanted to spend his life with the woman I'd become. But I also couldn't confront him, because that would mean admitting I'd heard something that wasn't meant for me. It would mean having a conversation I wasn't prepared for, about problems I wasn't sure how to fix. It would mean facing the possibility that our relationship, our engagement, our entire future together might be over. So instead, I did what the old Sarah would never have done. I sent David a text saying I wasn't feeling well and was going to my friend Emma's apartment for the evening. I didn't ask if it was okay. I didn't wait for his response. I just gathered my things and left the office, knowing that for the first time in months, I was making a decision based on what I needed rather than what would make David happy. As I drove through Denver traffic toward Emma's place in Capitol Hill, I kept hearing David's voice in my head. She's so desperate to please me that she's lost all her personality. The words played on repeat, each repetition driving the knife deeper into my chest. What hurt the most wasn't that he'd said it, it was that he was absolutely right. Emma opened her apartment door and took one look at my face before pulling me into the biggest hug of my life. I hadn't even said a word, but somehow she knew that whatever had happened was catastrophic. That's the thing about true friendship. The people who really know you can sense when your world has just been turned upside down. "Oh, honey," she said, leading me to her couch and wrapping a throw blanket around my shoulders. "What happened?" For the first time since I'd heard that voice memo, I started to cry. Not the pretty, controlled tears that David preferred, but ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. Emma didn't ask questions. She just held me while I fell apart in her living room, surrounded by the vibrant colors and eclectic art that reminded me of who I used to be. When I could finally speak, I told her everything. About the accidental voice memo, about David's conversation with his sister, about the devastating realization that I'd become someone even I didn't recognize. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally handing me tissues and refilling my wine glass. "Sarah," she said when I'd finished, "can I tell you something I've been wanting to say for months?" I nodded, bracing myself for another painful truth. "I've been watching you disappear piece by piece, and it's been killing me. You used to be the most vibrant, passionate person I knew. You had opinions about everything. You'd drag us all to weird independent films and underground art shows. You'd wear these amazing vintage dresses that made you look like a bohemian goddess. You'd stay up until 3 a.m. reading poetry or planning your next adventure." She paused, studying my face. "When was the last time you did any of those things?" I couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done anything purely for my own joy, without filtering it through David's preferences first. "The woman I just listened to you describe, the one David was talking about in that message, she's not you," Emma continued. "She's some version of you that you created to fit into a relationship that was never right for either of you. And maybe hearing this is exactly what you needed to wake up." But waking up felt impossible when the sleep had been so comfortable. Over the next few days, I moved through my life like a ghost. I went to work, came home, made dinner, watched Netflix with David, went to bed. On the surface, everything looked normal. David never mentioned the voice memo, clearly unaware that he'd sent it to the wrong person. He kissed me goodbye each morning and asked about my day each evening, just like always. But inside, I was unraveling. Every interaction with him became a painful reminder of how artificial our relationship had become. When he complimented my outfit, I wondered if he was lying. When he agreed with something I said, I wondered if I'd only said it because I knew he'd agree. When we watched movies together, I realized I'd been pretending to enjoy action films for 3 years, while my favorite romantic comedies gathered dust. I started paying attention to the small ways I'd been monitoring and adjusting my behavior around him, and it was horrifying. I'd unconsciously started speaking more quietly when I was excited about something. I'd learned to gauge his mood within seconds of him walking through the door and adjust my energy accordingly. I'd been asking permission for things that should have been my own decisions, from what to have for lunch to whether I could buy a new book. The wedding planning became torture. Every decision felt like another step toward a future that I was no longer sure I wanted. When we met with the florist to discuss centerpieces, I found myself agreeing to David's choice of white roses, even though I'd always dreamed of having wildflowers at my wedding, colorful and unstructured and full of life. When we tasted menu options with the caterer, I nodded along with his preference for beef and chicken, even though I'd become mostly vegetarian over the past year. A change I'd never even mentioned to him because I was afraid he'd find it inconvenient. But if you think the wedding planning was the worst part of those weeks, you're wrong. The worst part was looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at me. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing my own reflection and started seeing only what David saw when he looked at me. I'd lost the ability to have a relationship with myself that was separate from my relationship with him. I tried to remember what I'd been like before David, what I'd enjoyed, what had made me laugh, what had made me feel alive. I pulled out old photo albums from college and found pictures of myself that looked like they belonged to a different person. There I was at 22, wearing a bright yellow sundress and laughing so hard my eyes were completely closed. There I was at 24, covered in paint at an art class I'd taken just for fun. There I was at 25, hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park with a huge backpack and an even bigger smile. When had I stopped hiking? When had I stopped taking art classes? When had I stopped wearing yellow, which had always been my favorite color, until David mentioned that he thought it washed me out? I spent hours going through those old photos, trying to reconnect with the person I used to be. I found a journal I'd kept in my early 20s, filled with poetry I'd written and quotes that had inspired me and dreams I'd had for my future. The handwriting looked like mine, but the thoughts and feelings expressed were so foreign to who I'd become that it felt like reading someone else's diary. One entry, written when I was 24, stopped me cold. I never want to be the kind of woman who loses herself in a relationship, I'd written. I want to be with someone who loves me because of who I am, not in spite of it. I want to keep growing and changing and challenging myself even when I find someone to share my life with. I want to be the kind of couple that makes each other better, not smaller. Reading those words felt like getting a message from the grave. Emma opened her apartment door and took one look at my face before pulling me into the biggest hug of my life. I hadn't even said a word, but somehow she knew that whatever had happened was catastrophic. That's the thing about true friendship. The people who really know you can sense when your world has just been turned upside down. "Oh, honey," she said, leading me to her couch and wrapping a throw blanket around my shoulders. What happened? For the first time since I'd heard that voice memo, I started to cry. Not the pretty, controlled tears that David preferred, but ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. Emma didn't ask questions. She just held me while I fell apart in her living room, surrounded by the vibrant colors and eclectic art that reminded me of who I used to be. When I could finally speak, I told her everything. About the accidental voice memo, about David's conversation with his sister, about the devastating realization that I'd become someone even I didn't recognize. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally handing me tissues and refilling my wine glass. "Sarah," she said when I'd finished, "can I tell you something I've been wanting to say for months?" I nodded, bracing myself for another painful truth. "I've been watching you disappear piece by piece, and it's been killing me. You used to be the most vibrant, passionate person I knew. You had opinions about everything. You'd drag us all to weird, independent films and underground art shows. You'd wear these amazing vintage dresses that made you look like a bohemian goddess. You'd stay up until 3 a.m. reading poetry or planning your next adventure." She paused, studying my face. "When was the last time you did any of those things?" I couldn't answer because the truth was too painful. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done anything purely for my own joy, without filtering it through David's preferences first. "The woman I just listened to you describe, the one David was talking about in that message, she's not you," Emma continued. "She's some version of you that you created to fit into a relationship that was never right for either of you. And maybe hearing this is exactly what you needed to wake up. But waking up felt impossible when the sleep had been so comfortable. Over the next few days, I moved through my life like a ghost. I went to work, came home, made dinner, watched Netflix with David, went to bed. On the surface, everything looked normal. David never mentioned the voice memo, clearly unaware that he'd sent it to the wrong person. He kissed me goodbye each morning and asked about my day each evening, just like always, but inside, I was unraveling. Every interaction with him became a painful reminder of how artificial our relationship had become. When he complimented my outfit, I wondered if he was lying. When he agreed with something I said, I wondered if I'd only said it because I knew he'd agree. When we watched movies together, I realized I'd been pretending to enjoy action films for 3 years, while my favorite romantic comedies gathered dust. I started paying attention to the small ways I'd been monitoring and adjusting my behavior around him, and it was horrifying. I'd unconsciously started speaking more quietly when I was excited about something. I'd learned to gauge his mood within seconds of him walking through the door and adjust my energy accordingly. I'd been asking permission for things that should have been my own decisions, from what to have for lunch to whether I could buy a new book. The wedding planning became torture. Every decision felt like another step toward a future that I was no longer sure I wanted. When we met with the florist to discuss centerpieces, I found myself agreeing to David's choice of white roses, even though I'd always dreamed of having wildflowers at my wedding, colorful and unstructured and full of life. When we tasted menu options with the caterer, I nodded along with his preference for beef and chicken, even though I'd become mostly vegetarian over the past year. A change I'd never even mentioned to him because I was afraid he'd find it inconvenient. But if you think the wedding planning was the worst part of those weeks, you're wrong. The worst part was looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person staring back at me. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped seeing my own reflection and started seeing only what David saw when he looked at me. I'd lost the ability to have a relationship with myself that was separate from my relationship with him. I tried to remember what I'd been like before David, what I'd enjoyed, what had made me laugh, what had made me feel alive. I pulled out old photo albums from college and found pictures of myself that looked like they belonged to a different person. There I was at 22, wearing a bright yellow sundress and laughing so hard my eyes were completely closed. There I was at 24, covered in paint at an art class I'd taken just for fun. There I was at 25, hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park with a huge backpack and an even bigger smile. When had I stopped hiking? When had I stopped taking art classes? When had I stopped wearing yellow, which had always been my favorite color until David mentioned that he thought it washed me out? I spent hours going through those old photos, trying to reconnect with the person I used to be. I found a journal I'd kept in my early 20s, filled with poetry I'd written and quotes that had inspired me and dreams I'd had for my future. The handwriting looked like mine, but the thoughts and feelings expressed were so foreign to who I'd become that it felt like reading someone else's diary. One entry, written when I was 24, stopped me cold. I never want to be the kind of woman who loses herself in a relationship, I'd written. I want to be with someone who loves me because of who I am, not in spite of it. I want to keep growing and changing and challenging myself, even when I find someone to share my life with. I want to be the kind of couple that makes each other better, not smaller. Reading those words felt like getting a message from the grave, from a version of myself that had died so gradually I hadn't even noticed her slipping away. I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by photo albums and journals, crying for the woman I used to be and the relationship I'd convinced myself was perfect. The lowest point came on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after I'd heard the voice memo. David and I were having dinner at our usual Italian restaurant, the one he'd chosen because it was close to his office and had reliable Wi-Fi in case he needed to check work emails. I was wearing a navy blue dress that he'd complimented before, with my hair straightened and my makeup applied according to the routine I'd perfected to meet his preferences. Everything was exactly as it had been every Thursday for the past 6 months. And that's when it hit me. This was my life. This sterile, predictable, suffocating routine was what I'd chosen, what I'd fought so hard to maintain. I was 28 years old, and I felt like I was already dead. David was talking about a project at work, something about renewable energy software that usually made me nod and smile and ask appropriate follow-up questions. But that night, I couldn't focus on his words. All I could think about was the voice memo, the way his voice had sounded different when he talked to his sister, more alive and authentic than it ever sounded when he talked to me. "Sarah?" he said, and I realized he'd asked me a question that I hadn't heard. "Sorry," I said automatically. "I was just thinking about work stuff." "What did you say?" "I asked if you wanted to share the tiramisu," he said, but he was looking at me strangely. "Are you okay? You seem distracted lately." And that's when something inside me snapped, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a quiet, final way, like the last thread holding together something that had been fraying for months. "David," I heard myself say, "when was the last time I disagreed with you about something?" "Anything?" He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when was the last time I had a different opinion than you? When was the last time I wanted something different than what you wanted?" He set down his fork and studied my face. "I don't know. Why?" "Is there something you want to disagree about?" The question was so perfectly him, so perfectly practical and missing the point that I almost laughed. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking when you last saw me as a separate person with my own thoughts and feelings, instead of just an extension of yourself." "Sarah, what's going on? Where is this coming from?" I looked around the restaurant, at all the other couples having their own conversations, and wondered how many of them were as fundamentally disconnected as we were. How many of the women had lost themselves the way I had? How many of the men were as clueless about their partner's inner lives as David was about mine? "I don't know who I am anymore," I said, and it was the first completely honest thing I'd said to him in months. "I don't know what I like, what I want, what makes me happy. I know what makes you happy. I know what keeps our relationship smooth and comfortable. But I have no idea who Sarah is when she's not trying to be the perfect girlfriend." David reached across the table and took my hand, his face full of concern. "Honey, you're scaring me. Talk to me. What's really going on?" And I wanted to tell him about the voice memo, about hearing him describe me as a people-pleasing robot to his sister, about the devastating realization that he was right. I wanted to explain how I'd systematically erased myself to fit into his vision of the perfect relationship. I wanted to ask him if he missed the woman I used to be, if he even remembered her, but I couldn't. Because admitting I'd heard that conversation would mean confronting all the problems in our relationship that we'd both been pretending didn't exist. It would mean having the fight we'd been avoiding for 3 years. It would mean risking everything I'd worked so hard to build, even if that everything was built on a foundation of lies. So instead, I did what I'd been doing for 3 years. I backed down. "I'm sorry," I said, squeezing his hand. "I think I'm just stressed about work and wedding planning and everything. I didn't mean to take it out on you." The relief on his face was immediate and heartbreaking. He wanted to believe that simple explanation because it meant he didn't have to dig deeper, didn't have to examine our relationship, didn't have to face the possibility that we had serious problems. "It's okay," he said, bringing my hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Wedding planning is stressful for everyone. Maybe we should take a break from all the details for a while, just focus on enjoying each other." I nodded and smiled, playing my role perfectly, but inside I was screaming. This man, who claimed to love me enough to marry me, had just accepted the most superficial explanation possible for what was clearly a deeper crisis. He didn't want to know what was really wrong because he was afraid of what he might find. We finished dinner, making small talk about weekend plans and his sister's upcoming visit. The same kind of surface-level conversation that had become our specialty. He paid the check, I thanked him, and we drove home in comfortable silence that felt like a tomb. That night, as David slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and faced the truth I'd been avoiding. I was trapped in a relationship with someone who didn't really know me, who didn't want to know me, who preferred the sanitized version of me that I'd created for his comfort. And the worst part was I'd trapped myself. Every choice I'd made to be more agreeable, more accommodating, more perfect, had been a choice to move further away from authenticity and deeper into performance. I thought about the wedding, now just 6 months away. I thought about walking down that aisle in my beautiful dress, promising to love and honor a man who preferred my fake self to my real one. I thought about spending the next 50 years having conversations that never went below the surface, making decisions based on what would keep things peaceful rather than what would make me happy. The prospect was so suffocating that I had to get up and go sit in the bathroom with the door closed, just to remind myself that I could still make choices, even small ones like where to sit in my own apartment. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, really looked, for the first time in months. The woman staring back at me was perfectly put together, even at 1 a.m. Her hair was neat. Her skin was clear from expensive products David had bought her. Her pajamas were the modest, attractive kind that made her look like she belonged in a catalog for happy couples. But her eyes were empty. There was no life there, no spark, no indication that anyone was home behind the carefully constructed facade. She looked like a beautiful mannequin, perfectly dressed and positioned, but fundamentally lifeless. I thought about the photos I'd found from college, about the woman who'd worn yellow dresses and hiked mountains and written poetry. I tried to imagine what she would think of the woman in the mirror, and I knew she'd be horrified. She'd be heartbroken to see how completely I'd abandoned every dream, every value, every piece of authentic self-expression that had once defined me. That night, sitting on my bathroom floor at 2 a.m, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I didn't just need to fix my relationship with David. I needed to completely rebuild my relationship with myself. And I couldn't do that while I was still playing the role of the perfect fiancé, still monitoring every thought and feeling through the filter of what would keep him happy. For the first time since I'd heard that voice memo, I started to feel something other than despair. It was a tiny spark of something that felt almost like hope, but it was tinged with terror because I knew what it meant. It meant I was going to have to choose between the security of a relationship that was slowly killing my soul and the uncertainty of rediscovering who I really was. It meant I was going to have to risk everything I'd thought I wanted for a chance at something I'd forgotten I needed. And sitting there on the cold bathroom tile, I realized that the woman I used to be, the one who'd written those journal entries about never losing herself, was still in there somewhere, waiting for me to be brave enough to let her out. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen easily. Change never does when you're trying to resurrect a version of yourself that you buried so completely you'd forgotten she ever existed. But sometimes the universe conspires to help you in ways you never expect. And my help came in the form of David's sister Megan, arriving for her scheduled visit the very next weekend. I'd always liked Megan. She was 34, a freelance graphic designer living in Portland, with the kind of confident energy that reminded me of who I used to be. She wore her dark hair in a messy bun, dressed in vintage band t-shirts and jeans with paint stains, and had opinions about everything from politics to coffee to the best hiking trails in the Pacific Northwest. She was, in many ways, everything I'd stopped allowing myself to be. But what I didn't expect was how our conversation on Saturday morning would become the catalyst for everything that followed. David had gone to the gym, leaving Megan and me alone in the apartment with coffee and the kind of awkward small talk that happens when you realize you don't really know someone you've been pretending to know for 3 years. I was in full performance mode, asking polite questions about her work and making generic comments about how nice it was to see her again. Then Megan did something that stopped me cold. She looked at me directly, with the kind of focused attention I hadn't received from anyone in months, and said, "Sarah, can I ask you something personal?" My first instinct was to deflect, to give her some version of sure that didn't actually commit me to honesty. But something in her expression, a mixture of concern and determination, made me nod genuinely. "Are you happy?" she asked, such a simple question, but it hit me like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked me that? When was the last time I'd asked myself that? I opened my mouth to give her the automatic response. The same, "Yes, of course. David and I are so excited about the wedding that I'd been giving everyone for months." Instead, I started crying, not the controlled, quiet tears that I'd learned to produce when I needed sympathy without causing alarm. These were the raw, honest sobs that came from a place so deep I'd forgotten it existed. Megan didn't try to stop me or ask questions. She just handed me tissues and waited. "I don't remember what happy feels like," I finally admitted. "I remember what safe feels like, what comfortable feels like, what approved of feels like. But happy? I think I buried that so deep trying to be the perfect girlfriend that I lost it completely." Megan was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. Then she said something that changed everything. "You know, David called me a couple weeks ago. He was worried about you too." My blood ran cold. Did she know about the voice memo? Had David told her he'd sent it to me by accident? "He said you seemed different lately, more distant. He thought maybe you were having second thoughts about the wedding." I realized this was my moment. I could tell her about the voice memo, about what I'd heard, about the devastating realization that both David and I had been living a lie. Or I could continue playing my role, protecting everyone's feelings, maintaining the peace. For the first time in 3 years, I chose honesty. I told her everything. About the accidental voice message, about hearing David describe me as a people-pleasing robot, about the painful recognition that he was absolutely right. About how I'd systematically erased every part of myself that I thought might create conflict or make him question whether I was marriage material. Megan listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, my brother is a good man, but he's also terrified of conflict. He always has been. When we were kids, he'd rather go along with whatever everyone else wanted than risk an argument. I think he accidentally trained you to be the same way. And then when you became that way, he realized it wasn't actually what he wanted. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The thing is, I remember how he talked about you when you first started dating. He was obsessed with your independence, your creativity, your willingness to challenge him. He used to call me and talk for hours about some argument you'd had about a movie or a book, and he'd sound so alive, so engaged. I think he misses that version of you as much as you do. What came next was the most important conversation of my life. Megan helped me see that David and I had both been playing roles that weren't serving either of us. He'd been playing the part of the strong, decisive man who always knew what he wanted, and I'd been playing the part of the agreeable woman who wanted the same things. But neither of those people were who we actually were. The question is, Megan said, what are you going to do about it? And for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed: determination. I started small. That afternoon, when David suggested we watch his favorite action movie for the 100th time, I said, "Actually, I'd love to watch something different today. How about we each pick a movie we haven't seen and decide together?" He looked surprised but not annoyed. "Okay, sure. What did you have in mind?" I suggested a romantic comedy that had been on my list for months, and instead of the resistance I'd expected, he said, "I've been curious about that one too." It was a tiny moment, but it felt revolutionary. I'd expressed a preference, he'd respected it, and the world hadn't ended. Over the next few days, I started conducting what I called authenticity experiments. I ordered what I actually wanted at restaurants, even when it was different from David's choice. I wore colors that made me feel happy, even if they weren't his favorites. I expressed opinions about news articles and movies and books, even when I knew we might disagree. The most surprising thing was David's reaction. Instead of the conflict I'd been terrified of, most of my authenticity experiments were met with curiosity, sometimes even enthusiasm. When I wore a bright yellow dress that I'd been hiding in the back of my closet, he said, "Wow, that color really makes you glow. I don't think I've seen you wear yellow before." When I disagreed with his opinion about a restaurant we'd tried, he asked follow-up questions about what I'd liked and disliked, engaging with my perspective in a way he hadn't done in years. But the real breakthrough came the following Tuesday, exactly 3 weeks after I'd heard the voice memo that started everything. I was getting ready for work, standing in front of my closet, when I realized I was automatically reaching for another safe, neutral outfit that I knew David would approve of. I stopped, took a deep breath, and asked myself a question I hadn't asked in years. What do I want to wear today? The answer surprised me. I wanted to wear my vintage band t-shirt, the one from a concert I'd gone to in college, paired with a denim jacket covered in patches from art museums I'd visited. I wanted to wear my hair in its natural waves instead of spending 30 minutes straightening it. I wanted to wear the bright red lipstick that made me feel powerful and confident. So I did. David was in the kitchen making coffee when I came out of the bedroom, and I watched his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at me, and I felt that familiar panic rising in my chest. I was about to apologize, to go back and change into something more appropriate, when he smiled. "You look like you," he said softly. "What do you mean?" "You look like the woman I fell in love with. I'd forgotten how beautiful you are when you're being yourself." It was such a small comment, but it felt like permission to exist in my own skin. For the first time in years, I left the house feeling like Sarah instead of feeling like David's girlfriend. That day at work, something shifted. I found myself contributing ideas in meetings instead of just nodding along with whatever my colleagues suggested. I volunteered for a creative project that involved developing a campaign for a local art gallery, something the old Sarah would have jumped at, but the David-pleasing Sarah would have considered too risky. My boss, Jennifer, noticed the change immediately. "I don't know what's different about you lately," she said after a particularly productive brainstorming session, "but you seem more engaged, more like your old self." The momentum built over the following weeks. I started saying no to social events I didn't actually want to attend, instead of automatically agreeing because I thought that's what a good girlfriend would do. I began expressing preferences about how we spent our weekends, suggesting hiking trips and art gallery visits instead of just defaulting to David's preferred activities. Most importantly, I started having conversations with David about things that actually mattered to me. Instead of discussing only logistics and surface-level topics, I began sharing my thoughts about books I was reading, articles that interested me, dreams I had for my career and my life. To my amazement, these deeper conversations seemed to energize David too. He started opening up about his own dreams and concerns, talking about his work in ways that went beyond just the technical details. He shared his worries about his parents aging, his thoughts about whether he wanted children, his own creative aspirations that he'd been suppressing in favor of career stability. We were rediscovering each other. But more importantly, I was rediscovering myself. Each authentic choice I made, each time I chose honesty over harmony, each moment I prioritized my own happiness over his approval, I felt a little more alive. The real test came when I decided to address the elephant in the room, our wedding plans. Everything we'd chosen, from the venue to the menu to the music, reflected David's preferences with very little input from me. I'd convinced myself this was because I was easygoing and wanted him to be happy, but I realized it was because I'd been afraid to express what I actually wanted. "David," I said one evening, as we sat reviewing our vendor contracts, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked up from his laptop, and I could see a flicker of concern in his eyes. Conversations that started this way had become foreign territory for us. "I've been thinking about our wedding plans, and I realized I haven't been entirely honest about what I want." "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "I mean that most of the decisions we've made are based on your preferences, and I went along with them because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. But I have opinions too, and some of them are different from yours." Instead of the defensive reaction I'd feared, David closed his laptop and gave me his full attention. "Tell me," and so I did. I told him that I'd always dreamed of wildflowers instead of formal arrangements, that I wanted our first dance to be to a song that meant something to both of us, not just a safe, traditional choice, that I wanted to write our own vows instead of using the standard ones, that I wanted our wedding to feel like a celebration of who we actually were, not who we thought we were supposed to be. David listened to everything I said, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," he said finally, "why didn't you tell me any of this before?" It was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to have the conversation we should have had months ago. Because I was terrified that if I disagreed with you about anything, you'd realize I wasn't the right person for you. I thought being agreeable was the same thing as being lovable. He reached for my hand, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but serious. The woman I fell in love with wasn't agreeable. She was passionate and opinionated and challenging. She made me think about things differently. She pushed me to be better. Somewhere along the way, I think we both forgot that conflict isn't the enemy of love. It's part of it. What happened next changed everything. David told me that he'd been feeling disconnected from me for months, that he'd missed the passionate debates we used to have, the way I used to challenge his assumptions and introduce him to new ideas. He admitted that he'd started to feel like he was engaged to a stranger, someone who seemed determined to agree with him about everything, even when he could tell she had different opinions. "I want to marry the real you," he said, "not the version of you that you think I want. And I want you to marry the real me, not the version of me that feels like he has to have all the answers." It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, and it felt like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. We talked until 3 a.m, sharing thoughts and feelings we'd been hiding from each other, admitting to fears and dreams we'd been too afraid to voice. We decided to postpone the wedding, not because we didn't want to get married, but because we wanted to take time to rediscover who we were as individuals and who we could be as a couple when we weren't playing roles for each other's comfort. The months that followed our decision to postpone the wedding were simultaneously the most challenging and the most liberating of my life. When you've spent years building an identity around being someone else's perfect partner, learning to be yourself again feels like learning to walk after a long illness. Every step is uncertain, but each one makes you stronger. We called our families and close friends to explain that we were postponing the wedding, not calling it off, but taking time to work on ourselves and our relationship. The reactions ranged from concern to confusion to outright disapproval. My mother was devastated, convinced that postponing meant we were breaking up and that I was throwing away the best thing that had ever happened to me. David's parents were more understanding, but I could hear the worry in their voices during our awkward phone conversations. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" my mother asked during one particularly difficult call. "David is a good man, Sarah. Men like him don't wait around forever." Her words stung because they echoed every fear I'd had about being authentic in my relationship. But for the first time in years, I had an answer that came from my own conviction rather than from anxiety about losing someone's approval. "Mom," I said, "if David is the right person for me, he'll want me to be happy with who I actually am. And if he's not, then postponing this wedding is the best thing I could do for both of us." The real work began with therapy, both individual and couples counseling. I started seeing Dr. Patricia Williams, a therapist who specialized in helping people reconnect with their authentic selves after losing themselves in relationships. The first few sessions were brutal. She asked me questions I couldn't answer, like what my favorite color was, what kind of music made me feel alive, what I wanted to do with my career beyond just having a job that provided financial stability. You've been living your life as a reaction to someone else's preferences for so long. Dr. Williams told me during our fourth session that you've lost touch with your own internal compass. The good news is that it's still there, buried under years of people-pleasing behaviors. But it's going to take time and intention to excavate it. She gave me assignments that felt simultaneously simple and impossibly difficult. Spend 1 hour each week doing something that brought me joy, without considering whether David would approve or understand. Write in a journal every morning, focusing not on events, but on feelings and desires. Notice when I was about to ask for someone else's opinion about something I could decide for myself, and practice making those decisions independently. The journal writing was particularly revelatory. On the first day, I sat with a blank page for 20 minutes before writing. I don't know what I feel or what I want. But gradually, thoughts and desires that I'd been suppressing for years began to surface. I realized I'd always loved photography but had stopped taking pictures because David found my habit of stopping to photograph interesting buildings and street art annoying during our walks. I remembered that I used to write poetry, something I'd abandoned because David had once made a dismissive comment about artsy stuff early in our relationship. I discovered that I missed having female friendships that went deeper than complaining about work and planning birthday dinners. The couples therapy with David was equally eye-opening. Our therapist, Dr. Michael Chen, helped us see how we'd fallen into complementary dysfunctional patterns. David had taken on the role of the decision-maker partly because I'd abdicated that responsibility, and I'd become the people-pleaser partly because he'd grown uncomfortable with conflict and disagreement. Healthy relationships require two whole people, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. When one person shrinks to make the other more comfortable, you don't get harmony, you get resentment and disconnection. David had his own work to do. He had to examine why he'd been more comfortable with my fake agreeableness than with my authentic opinions. He had to confront his own fears about conflict and his tendency to interpret disagreement as rejection. He had to learn to see my growing assertiveness as a sign of health rather than a threat to our relationship. But what really started changing everything was when I began doing the things that the old Sarah had loved, regardless of whether they fit into our couple's routine. I signed up for a photography class at the community college, something I'd been wanting to do for years but had never mentioned because it would mean spending Saturday mornings away from David. I joined a book club that focused on contemporary women's literature, authors and topics that David had no interest in, but that made me feel intellectually alive for the first time in years. The photography class was particularly transformative. Being behind a camera again felt like coming home to myself. I'd forgotten how much I loved the process of seeing the world through a different lens, literally and figuratively. I'd forgotten how satisfying it was to create something beautiful, something that existed purely because I'd chosen to create it. My instructor, Maria Santos, was a professional photographer in her 50s who had the kind of creative confidence I'd once possessed. After our third class, she pulled me aside. You have a real eye for this, she said, looking at the photos I'd taken of urban architecture around Denver. Have you ever thought about pursuing photography more seriously? The question hit me like a revelation. When was the last time I'd thought about pursuing anything seriously? For my own fulfillment, rather than for financial security or social approval. I used to dream about being a photographer, I admitted. But that was a long time ago before I decided I needed to be more practical. Dreams don't have expiration dates, Maria said. They just get buried under fear and other people's expectations. I started carrying my camera everywhere, rediscovering my love for capturing moments of beauty and meaning in everyday life. David noticed the change immediately. Instead of the distracted, going through the motions person I'd been for months, I was energized, excited about something that was entirely my own. I haven't seen you this passionate about anything in years, he said one evening as I showed him photos from a downtown street festival I'd attended. You're glowing when you talk about it. The book club introduced me to a group of women who were having the kinds of conversations I'd been craving without knowing it. We talked about books, yes, but also about relationships, careers, dreams, politics, everything I'd been avoiding discussing because I'd been afraid of having opinions that might create conflict. One of the women, Janet, was going through her own relationship awakening at 42, realizing that she'd spent 20 years deferring to her husband's preferences about everything from where they lived to how they spent their vacations. Another, Christina, was a successful lawyer who was questioning whether the career she'd built was actually what she wanted or just what she thought she was supposed to want. We're all recovering people-pleasers here, Janet said one evening as we discussed a novel about a woman who left her marriage to pursue art. It's like we all got the message somewhere that being agreeable was more important than being authentic. These women became my support system as I continued the difficult work of rediscovering who I was. They celebrated my small victories, like the day I told David I wanted to spend a Saturday hiking alone instead of going to brunch with his friends. They listened without judgment when I struggled with guilt about disappointing people by having boundaries. My relationship with Emma also deepened during this time. I'd been so focused on being the perfect girlfriend that I'd neglected my oldest friendship, turning Emma into someone I complained to rather than someone I truly connected with. As I became more authentic in my romantic relationship, I also became more present in my friendships. It's like getting my best friend back, Emma told me after we'd spent an afternoon at an art gallery, something we used to do regularly before I'd started filtering all my activities through David's interests. I miss this version of you so much. The changes weren't always easy, and they didn't happen without conflict. David and I had fights during this period, real disagreements about important things, something we'd been avoiding for years. We argued about money when I decided to invest in better photography equipment. We disagreed about how to spend holidays when I expressed a desire to start some traditions that reflected both our backgrounds rather than just defaulting to his family's preferences. But these conflicts felt different than the fights I'd feared for so long. They weren't relationship-ending explosions. They were conversations between two people who were learning to respect each other's individual perspectives. Instead of one of us winning and the other losing, we were learning to find solutions that honored both our needs. The most significant change came when I decided to pursue a career transition. My marketing job had always felt like something I'd fallen into rather than chosen, a safe option that paid well and didn't require too much passion or creativity. But as I reconnected with my love of photography and visual storytelling, I began to envision a different professional future. I started freelancing as a photographer on weekends, shooting small events and family portraits. The work energized me in ways my marketing job never had. I was using creative skills I'd almost forgotten I possessed, interacting with clients in ways that felt authentic and meaningful, creating work that I was genuinely proud of. I want to transition to photography full-time, I told David one evening, my heart pounding because it was the biggest independent decision I'd made in years. His response surprised me. Instead of immediately expressing concern about the financial instability or trying to talk me out of it, he asked questions. What was my business plan? How long did I think it would take to build a sustainable client base? What kind of photography excited me most? I can see how alive this makes you, he said finally. If this is what you want to pursue, I want to support you. It was the first time in our relationship that he'd responded to a major life decision of mine with curiosity and encouragement rather than caution and control. It felt like proof that we were both growing, both learning to be partners rather than one decision maker and one follower. Within 6 months of starting therapy and reconnecting with my authentic self, everything about my life looked different. I was pursuing work that fulfilled me creatively. I had friendships that nourished my intellectual and emotional life. I was in a romantic relationship that felt like a partnership between equals rather than a dynamic where one person disappeared to keep the other comfortable. But perhaps most importantly, I liked who I was again. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone with opinions, passions, goals, and dreams. I saw someone who wore clothes that made her feel beautiful rather than clothes that made her invisible. I saw someone who was willing to risk conflict in service of authenticity, who valued her own happiness enough to pursue it even when it required difficult conversations. David and I set a new wedding date, but this time we planned a celebration that reflected both our authentic selves. Wildflowers and personal vows and music that told the story of our real relationship, complete with its challenges and growth. Our families were still adjusting to the changes in both of us, but the people who loved us most could see that we were happier, more alive, more genuinely connected than we'd been in years. 6 months after hearing that accidental voice memo that could have destroyed my relationship, I realized it had actually saved it. Not because it led us back to who we'd been before, but because it forced us to become who we were meant to be all along. Today, as I sit in my home office editing photos from a wedding I shot last weekend, I can barely recognize the woman I was a year ago. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was the most important work I've ever done. Not just for my relationship with David, but for my relationship with myself. We did get married 8 months after our original date, in a ceremony that felt like the most authentic celebration of our love I could have imagined. I wore a dress I'd chosen because it made me feel beautiful, not because it fit someone else's idea of what a bride should look like. We exchanged vows we'd written ourselves, promises that acknowledged our growth and our commitment to supporting each other's continued evolution. Our first dance was to a song that told our real story, complete with its challenges and triumphs. But the wedding was just one day. The real victory has been building a marriage where both people get to exist fully, where disagreement is welcome, where growth is celebrated rather than feared. David and I still have our conflicts, but now they feel like opportunities for deeper understanding rather than threats to our relationship's survival. He's grown too in ways that continue to surprise and delight me. He started painting again, something he'd given up in college because he thought it wasn't practical. He's learned to express his own needs and desires instead of just reacting to mine. He's become someone who celebrates my independence rather than feeling threatened by it. My photography business has grown beyond what I ever imagined possible. Last month, I had my first gallery showing, a collection of portraits capturing other women in moments of authentic self-expression. The opening night was attended by friends who've watched my entire transformation, including Emma, my book club, my photography classmates, and even Dr. Williams, who said she'd never seen such a clear example of someone reclaiming their authentic self. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when a young woman approached me at the gallery, tears in her eyes. "I feel like I'm looking at my future," she said, studying a self-portrait I'd taken 6 months into my journey back to myself. "I've been losing myself in my relationship, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Your photos make me believe it's possible." That conversation reminded me why sharing this story feels so important. I know I'm not the only woman who's ever looked in the mirror and wondered where she went. I'm not the only person who's ever traded their authentic self for relationship security, or who's confused being agreeable with being lovable. The accidental voice memo that shattered my world was actually the greatest gift I could have received. Not because it was easy to hear those truths about myself, but because it forced me to confront realities I'd been avoiding. Sometimes we need that external perspective, that shock of recognition, to see patterns we've become blind to. Here's what I learned from my journey back to myself, and I hope these insights can help anyone who recognizes themselves in my story. First, authentic love requires authentic people. You cannot build a genuine relationship while wearing a mask, no matter how beautiful or comfortable that mask might be. The person who falls in love with your performance isn't actually falling in love with you, and that foundation will never support the weight of a lifetime together. Real intimacy requires the courage to be seen fully, even when that visibility feels risky. Second, conflict is not the enemy of love. I spent years believing that disagreement meant failure, that harmony was the highest goal of any relationship. But I learned that couples who never fight are often couples where one person has stopped existing as an individual. Healthy conflict means two whole people engaging with each other's perspectives, negotiating differences, growing through challenge. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary for authentic connection. Third, you cannot love someone you don't know, and you cannot know someone who's hiding their true self. When I was performing the role of perfect girlfriend, I was preventing David from actually knowing me. And when he accepted that performance without questioning it, he was preventing himself from falling in love with the real me. We were both settling for a connection that felt safe, but ultimately hollow. Fourth, people-pleasing is not selfless, it's actually profoundly selfish. I thought I was being caring and considerate by always deferring to David's preferences, but I was actually forcing him to be responsible for all our decisions, all our conflicts, all our growth. I was making him carry the entire weight of our relationship while I hid behind agreeableness. True partnership requires both people to show up fully. Fifth, change is possible at any stage of life or relationship. I was 28 when I heard that voice memo, already engaged, already deep into patterns that felt permanent. It would have been easy to tell myself it was too late to change, that I'd made my choices and needed to live with them. But authenticity doesn't have an expiration date. You can reclaim yourself at 30, 50, 70, or any age when you're ready to do the work. Finally, the most important relationship you'll ever have is the one with yourself. All other relationships are reflections of that primary connection. When you lose yourself, you lose your capacity for genuine intimacy with anyone else. When you reclaim yourself, you open up possibilities for connection that you never knew existed. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my experience, I want you to know that change is possible. It's not easy, and it might not look the way you expect, but it's possible. You don't have to stay trapped in patterns that are slowly erasing who you are. You don't have to choose between love and authenticity. Start small. Notice when you're about to ask someone else's opinion about something you could decide for yourself. Pay attention to moments when you automatically defer to someone else's preferences without considering your own. Spend time alone doing things that bring you joy, without worrying about whether anyone else understands or approves. Find your support system. Whether it's therapy, friends who've known you since before you started performing, or communities of people doing similar work on themselves, you don't have to do this alone. Transformation is easier when you're surrounded by people who believe in your capacity for growth. Be patient with yourself and with the people you love. Change is threatening, even positive change, because it disrupts familiar patterns. The people in your life might resist your growth initially, not because they don't love you, but because they're afraid of losing the version of you they've grown comfortable with. Give them time to adjust, but don't let their fear stop your progress. Most importantly, trust that you are worth knowing. You are worth the effort it takes to excavate your authentic self from under years of performance and people-pleasing. Your real thoughts, feelings, desires, and dreams matter. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your preferences deserve to be considered. You deserve to take up space in your own life. The woman I am today, sitting in my home office surrounded by photographs that tell stories of authentic human moments, is someone I'm proud to be. She's not perfect, she's not always easy to be around, and she definitely creates more conflict than the people-pleasing version of me ever did. But she's real, she's mine, and she's worth every difficult conversation, every moment of uncertainty, every risk I took to find her again. That accidental voice memo could have ended my relationship, and for a while, I thought it would. Instead, it ended my relationship with inauthenticity. It forced me to choose between the safety of performance and the vulnerability of being real. It gave me back my voice, my choices, my life. If my story resonates with you, if you found yourself nodding along or recognizing patterns in your own life, I hope you'll take that recognition as an invitation to begin your own journey back to yourself. The path isn't always clear, and it's rarely comfortable, but it leads to a life where you get to exist fully, love authentically, and be proud of who you see in the mirror. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most challenging and transformative periods of my life. If this story has touched you in any way, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to confront who you'd become versus who you really were? What did that awakening look like for you? Your stories matter too, and sharing them helps create a community where authenticity is celebrated and supported. Please consider subscribing to this channel if these kinds of transformational stories speak to you, and give this video a thumbs up if you found value in my experience. Remember, it's never too late to come home to yourself. The real you is still there, waiting patiently for you to be brave enough to let her out. And when you do, you might just discover that the life you thought you wanted pales in comparison to the life you never knew you could have.